As the whip speaker of the government side today, I want to look over the debate in a very clear and concise manner. I want to look at three main issues. First of all, I want to look at the summit, the G20, before the summit actually happens. Then I want to look at the summit itself, what actually goes on in these meetings. Then third, I want to look at what actually happens after these meetings, the results. So moving on into the first point of issue in today's debate, the pre-summit issues. Now basically, our definition of practical implications was results according to goals. So there's a burden on the opposition side to prove that the G20 actually meets its goals of mutual development and economic development for the world. But we say, and also, we talked about the reasons. We also talked about they needed to prove that there's a clear goal of the G20 and why the G20 actually works to meet these goals. And they give us an example about the London summit and how they provided, they came to an agreement of an agenda. But we think that just simply having, choosing your goals, deciding on your goals, on the London summit, it actually just proves that the G20 really didn't have a goal to begin with. We think that the G20 really doesn't have anything. It has no binding power. It has no treaty. For instance, the UN has the UN Charter to fall back on, but the G20 really doesn't have any set goals, set purposes. It's just 20 nations that come to a table and decide what to do. And we think that because the first argument of the government side, how it's non-binding, we're basically saying that it's not official. Basically what we're saying is that there's no legal binding, there's no mandate, and there's no commitment for these countries to do anything at all. Also, there's no clear guidelines for the procedures or the membership. The G20 itself agrees to the fact that there is no clear criteria of how they choose these members and how these 20 members actually came to exist. It's just 20 random countries that came to this table and said, we're going to help economic development. And we think there's a problem with this. We think that basically it means that so we want to ask, how does 20 random countries actually become a vital organization that actually, represents the world and actually does bring benefits to our world? It's basically saying, it's like me arguing, I'm going to go up with Wongi and Taeyeon and just make a group for world peace. But really, that doesn't make sense. The actual existence of G20 raises a lot of questions. But we say it's still okay. It's still okay for me, Wongi and Taeyeon to actually get together and say that we're doing something. What's important is that whether or not they're really doing something, and which is what I want to address on the second part of the speech, which is the actual summit. What's happening in the summit? The opposition gave us a big example, a big argument about international cooperation. It sounds good. Of course, international cooperation is good. But I have four things to say to that. First of all, we're saying that there isn't that much cooperation in the status quo. In this whole summit, in the summits before that, you have countries fighting over the currency wars, and basically all the agreement that you have is that, okay, let's just put these things aside and let's just go to the next summit and discuss about some issues. But really, you haven't agreed on anything or any specific numerical terms, specific agendas. And we think that's a problem. The second thing that I want to say is that there's no secretariat. Basically, what we're saying is that there's no big leader or no body to actually intervene in some disputes. There's no body to actually handle the problems that come at the G20 meeting. We also said that the third thing I want to say is that there's no mechanism to settle disputes. What happens if me and Wongi fight over some stupid reason? There's no one to solve that problem, and there's no mechanism to solve that problem at all. So really what we're saying, what we see at the G20 is that we have 20 countries that somehow have to agree on their own, but they really haven't provided us why there's a clear mechanism that can solve future disputes. The fourth thing I want to say is that there's no incentive. What incentive is there for these countries to go out their way and bring all of this change to the world? For instance, we give you examples of the IMF and the WTO, which is a different case. The IMF, they're given voting power according to the amount of money and resources you actually invest into the IMF. But the G20, it's just 20 countries that really don't have an incentive. They fail to prove that there's an incentive that will make a clear reason for change. And having said these four things, the government's second argument was basically about how there's a contradictory composition of the G20 itself, how it's actually even worse. The first thing we want to talk about, the first contradictory aspect we want to talk about is the actual length of the procedure. The actual length of the G20 procedure is about 2 days. You have 5 hours a day to discuss on very important, heavy international economic policies that's going to affect the world for years to come. I don't really think that 20 different people from 20 different nations that speak different languages languages can really put a specific and very thorough plan in just 2 days. We think there's a problem. It's contradictory. And the second thing we want to say is that the goals are focused specifically on the G20 country nations themselves and on economics. Basically, what we're saying is that these countries don't really have that much knowledge about the environment. They don't really care about countries in Africa, the third world countries. These 20 countries are they take up 85% of the wealth of the world, and therefore, thus, it's more obvious that they will focus on developing and developed nations. They don't really focus on environmental issues. They don't focus on health issues. All of these issues that should be addressed. We think that there can be problems that come from the agreements themselves. So let's move on into the third and final aspect of today's debate. No, thank you, sir. Which is the results. After the summit, what happens? First of all, we said in the government, it's one of the arguments in our first argument, how it's non-binding. There's no legal binding. So basically, if you don't really want to follow some of the agreements that you had at the G20, you don't have to, because there's no legal procedure or legal binding that actually, puts you apart and says that you have to, have some kind of punishment. It's just an agreement made by 20 countries, and really, there's really no enforcing power between that. We think it's going to hinder the practical implications that they need to prove in today's debate. Also, the opposition, we heard, so basically, to make it simple, let's just look at the examples of these real-life practical implications that the opposition gave us. First of all, they talked about a 1.1 trillion stimulus package. But first of all, I want to ask you, how did that really help economic development around the world? How is that mutual prosperity for everyone? It didn't really affect the countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. They didn't really prove why a 1.1 trillion stimulus package was such an important thing for economies around the world. They also talked about the IMF, but the IMF loans are actually hurting developing nations because they can't pay off their loans. And also they talked about how they just set an agenda for future economic policies. But setting an agenda isn't enough. It's not a practical implication. They also talked about one of the things that the G20 did was finding out the cause of the 2008-2009 economic recession. But that's not really a practical implication. Even Taeyeon and Wongi know the cause of the 2008 economic recession. And basically, they really haven't given us, at the end of the debate, a clear reason or a clear example of a practical implication. And we on team opposition, on team government, argue that they will not and will never find a practical implication for the G20. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 38 seconds.